Ah, foreign policy, one of the most defining parts of the modern day United States. One of the first things that come to mind when you think of the US today is the constant foreign intervention it constantly gets itself into, most recently in Afghanistan. However, you may or may not be surprised to know that this was not always the case. Today, we will cover the evolution of foreign policy, not for all of American history though. We will be looking at a time period with great change in American foreign policy, kind of like a roller coaster, basically like puberty. Today, we will be covering how American foreign involvement evolved from 1898 to 1948. First, we must set the stage up with a little bit of context. The United States was actually founded on values of isolationism. One of the earliest calls for isolationism in the nation can be found in George Washington's farewell address, which was given on September 17, 1796. This is when George Washington stepped down from the presidency after his second term. The guy really needed a break, to be honest. He warned the American people that they should avoid permanent alliances with other countries, but rather depend on temporary alliances for emergency situations. This was motivated by Washington's anger over the French already messing around with American politics and his goal to keep America out of the larger British-French conflict at the time. This statement by Washington would be the guiding factor for American foreign policy for the next century, although during this century, America would gradually move farther and farther away from this philosophy asserted by Washington. Continuance Washington belief for now was President James Monroe and his Monroe Doctrine in 1823. This was a declaration by President Monroe for European nations to stay in Europe and their current colonies. And in return, the US will stay in America and only involve itself in American affairs. This encouraged the United States to keep to itself and avoid the dangerous entangling alliances Washington warned of. Throughout the 19th century, one common theme that would push the United States away from its isolationist roots is the idea of manifest destiny. This was the concept that the United States had the God-given right to spread its ideals throughout North America and had a responsibility to expand west because of it. This idea would influence decisions like the Louisiana Purchase, Mexican-American War, the purchase of Alaska, and other aspects of American westward expansion. The frontier was an essential part of American history. According to the Frontier Thesis in 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner stated that the frontier, an unsettled western land, was the most important factor in the developing nation. This everlasting desire to expand westward would eventually lead to imperialism, where a nation expands its power through diplomacy or force. The United States used this to broaden its influence and expand its ideas outside of the boundaries of North America. Some Americans, specifically some Protestant ones, now had a new goal in mind. They formed missionary societies seeking to expand their reach, particularly in Asia. They were influenced by such works as Reverend Josiah Strong's Our Country, Its Possible Future and Its Present Crisis, 1885. Missionaries sought to spread the gospel throughout the country and abroad. This also demonstrates the developing white man's burden. This is the belief that white Anglo-Saxon culture was, quote-unquote, objectively the greatest culture on earth. Therefore, they were required to spread the moral ideas of Western society because of this superiority complex. Another example of imperialism. The Navy was also strengthened by Alfred Thayer Mahan, who wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890. This text called for the United States to strengthen its navy, create naval bases across the globe, and to create a nice little canal in Central America to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. All of these goals would eventually be fulfilled. His first goal was fulfilled by the Naval Act of 1890, which would lead to the creation of a new, modern fleet for America's Navy. And with that, the stage is set. Now we can kick back, relax, and watch foreign policy develop. The Spanish-American War begins right when our clock for this period begins, 1898. Participation in this war was a turning point in American history because it was the first example of American interventionism. Essentially, it was the first time that the US involved itself in a conflict not directly related to itself. Hey, kid, do you remember the USS Maine?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, do you know how it was destroyed?
The Spanish, right?
That's where you're wrong, kid. It was probably due to a fire in the ammunition stocks. No lollipop for you. I need an adult. As you can see here, little Jimmy was led to believe that the Spanish were responsible for destroying the USS Maine, the main cause for the Spanish-American War. Pun fully intended, by the way. But why did this happen? What encouraged Americans to hop on the bandwagon that blamed the Spanish for the explosion of the Maine? This was likely an effect of yellow journalism. This type of journalism is similar to what we call clickbait today. Journalists would overhype situations so that they could sell more papers, and word about a war with Spain would have been big news in 1898 due to the public's support and sympathy for Cuban rebels oppressed by Spain. Eventually, Congress would send a joint resolution that acknowledged Cuban independence, wanted Spain out of Cuba, and promised not to annex the Cuban island for American purposes. The Spanish government was not a fan of this, and war broke out between the two on April 25, 1898. The United States had an aggressive approach towards the Spanish, and the American Navy was able to reach many faraway islands in the Pacific, such as the Philippines, to fend off the Spanish. This was due to the built-up American Navy that Mahan addressed in his 1890 book. The war was a done deal in about 4 months, with the United States victory. This loss for Spain would be the nail in the coffin for its colonial holdings in the Western Hemisphere. They had a good run. This would lead to the Treaty of Paris in 1898. The United States took possession of Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Cuba was granted independence from the Spanish as well. The signing of this treaty bolstered American influence overseas. Despite all this, not everyone was a fan. The Anti-Imperialist League was created in June 1898, primarily to combat the annexation of the Philippines by America. It had many prominent figures such as Andrew Carnegie, Mark Twain, among other giants at the time period, but alas, the Treaty of Paris was eventually signed, and this law quickly fizzled away. It is important to note that not everyone was supportive of American expansion and imperialism at this time, and this sentiment would grow stronger with time later on. Another contribution to this influence overseas was the annexation of Hawaii. Pearl Harbor was a key location for the United States because of its function as a coaling station for ships to reach faraway territories in the Pacific, such as the Philippines and Guam. The U.S. had access to this valuable natural harbor through the Reciprocity Treaty with the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1875. However, many white elites in Hawaii did not want to live under the kingdom, but rather join the United States of America. In 1893, they had a coup against Queen Liliuokalani, and some U.S. soldiers may or may not have come to show their support. Eventually, on August 12, 1898, Hawaii was taken under the Eagle's wing and became a U.S. territory, furthering its position as a pit stop in America's expanding Pacific Empire. It was known as the Gateway to the Pacific because of this trait, and the move to annex it was widely popular among many Americans. Throughout this whole Spanish-American debacle, the people have been generally quite supportive of the imperial actions made by the nation. This is likely due to jingoism, which was basically an extreme patriotism that was pretty aggressive towards other nations. Directly after the U.S. acquired a variety of cool new vacation islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean, the responsibility to quote-unquote Christianize and civilize the new territories kicked in. This relates back to the idea of the white man's burden, that Western nations had this duty to teach their quote-unquote superior ways to their so-called lesser territories. These actions were an attempt to assimilate these territories into the rest of the nation, and results varied. Hawaii is now a state, showing that it worked. Puerto Rico remains a territory, which shows it works. But the Philippines eventually gained independence and left the Union, showing that their attempts did not work as well. In 1903, the Platt Amendment was signed by Cuba and the United States. This would allow the U.S. to meddle in Cuban affairs for the sake of preserving its independence as a U.S. protectorate. The Cubans were very reluctant to include this amendment to their constitution, but despite this, they did so. About a year after the conclusion of the Spanish-American War, we see America's continuous expansion in the Pacific. U.S. Secretary of State John Hay would lead this with the creation of the Open Door Notes. These were a series of notes sent to prominent nations to request the creation of an open market with equal trading opportunities for all nations in China. This was to ensure that the U.S. had a fair chance of trade in China due to its lack of involvement beforehand. It was also to make sure that China was not cut up into a bunch of different colonies like a birthday cake at a 2-year-old's birthday party, because of its instability caused by the Boxer Rebellion. The ironic part about this is, despite talking about China, China had absolutely no say in this situation, which is pretty bad. Our friend John Hay would also work to connect the two great oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, with a jolly little canal. This was first put into motion with the Hay-Ponsonfot Treaty in 1901, which gave the US clearance to build a canal in Central America with equal British access. A jolly little agreement between two chaps. Congress would eventually choose Panama to be its canal destination, and a 10-mile wide strip of land was purchased. The canal was started in 1904 and completed construction in 1914. This would be the fruition of Mahan's third request in his book about sea power in 1890 as well. Alright kids, time to learn. Today's proverb of the day is, speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far. This West African proverb was the guiding principle of President Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy, and was the foundation of all parts of his decisions, not only in the international realm, but the domestic one as well. What this proverb basically teaches is that one should not be perceived as aggressive, but not as a pushover either. TR definitely lived up to this iconic saying and became the father of big stick diplomacy, foreign policy based on these ideals. This guy was a mad lad. An example of this policy in action can be seen through the Great White Fleet. This was a group of Navy battleships that journeyed around the globe together from December 1907 to February 1909. And essentially, it was the US flexing its naval muscles on the rest of the world and proving itself to be on par with the rest of the West. Also proving itself to be the best of the best. I kinda like that rhyme, not gonna lie. Another example of the stick swinging and soft speaking in action is seen through the Roosevelt Corollary. This was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, which made the US the police of North America. The Roosevelt Corollary essentially justified US intervention in Latin American internal affairs as a last result if the nation was damaging the United States or the wider American sphere. This justification would be used to let the United States simply waltz into the internal workings of any American nation, and there wasn't anything anybody could do to stop it. The Corollary often used military strength to enforce these ideals and became a justification for the United States to poke its nose in nations like Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. It would also function as some sort of mediator between Europe and the American nations. European nations would often hound these Latin American nations to pay their debts back. However, the US would only be the one to actually enforce these demands instead of Europeans. This constant intervention would upset the various Latin American nations. They began to despise the United States and considered it a bad neighbor. No bueno. The election of 1912. Oh boy, what a mess it was. The split vote of Republicans would essentially give Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson a walk on the yellow brick road straight to the White House. The foreign policy utilized by Wilson was known as moral diplomacy. This was a policy obviously founded on morality rather than the materialism promoted by past presidents. The United States was meant to be a role model for other countries, not just another world power seeking more benefits. The Panama Canal Act of 1914 was an example of this role model status that Wilson hoped to achieve for America. This act would pull back its 1912 counterpart, which allowed the US to ignore the toll put onto the Panama Canal. The Jones Act in 1916 would allow the Philippines to receive US territorial status and an eventual promise for independence, which would arrive in 1946. However, Wilson was no knight in shining armor. He attempted to restore positive relations with Latin American nations, however, insisted that their governments be democratic, and this would cause issues in some of these countries. In 1915, Wilson sent US Marines to restore order in Haiti due to a rebellion, and he reacted similarly to a rebellion in the Dominican Republic just a year later. These actions by Wilson kept relations between Latin America and the United States sour. This whole situation exemplifies how morality played such a large role in moral diplomacy. However, not everything that one may perceive as moral is necessarily right, and this is shown in the case of Wilson. In 1914, one of the largest conflicts the world has ever witnessed would start, World War I. Now this is a war in Europe, and wasn't even close to the United States. It was between Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire as the Central Powers, facing off against the Allies, France, Russia, Britain, and Belgium, and a bunch of other countries as well. The Central Powers, particularly the Germans, were infamous for using a variety of dirty tricks to have their way. The Germans would gas people and utilize U-boats against neutral ships. The US believed that its priority was to stay neutral, and its involvement in the war was limited to mass production and selling ammunition and other war commodities to allied nations. The United States would make absolute bank from this. Good job on focusing on yourself, America. We're proud of you. Wilson was re-elected in 1916 solely based on the fact that he was the guy that kept America out of the war, showing how popular neutrality was at this time with the American people. This shows a blatant contrast between the interventionist attitude seen in the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was seen as a rescue mission to save poor little Cuba from the Spanish brute, and the conflict was hyped up because of yellow journalism. However, World War I was a distant European war that the American people did not support. It didn't concern the US, and it was just another one of those silly European affairs that Washington dude told America to not get in. You know, Washington's farewell address? Yeah? However, this would soon change. The Germans began to tick off the United States by using their U-boats to destroy neutral ships with American passengers, most notably the Lusitania in 1915. The United States tried to give Germany a variety of warnings on their actions, but Germany wouldn't heed to this advice. Then came the Zimmermann Note, which was a telegram sent from Germany to Mexico to encourage them to get involved in the war. However, this wouldn't work out in Germany's favor because the message was intercepted by the British. No bueno. The UK notified the US immediately, and this was the last straw for the Americans. In 1917, the United States finally joined the war on the side of the Allies. The introduction of US troops to the trenches would swiftly end the European stalemate and hand the victory over to the Allies. However, America would gain absolutely nothing from its involvement, only lost American lives. This would reinforce the isolationist attitude many Americans had up to this point. But Wilson had another point. 14 of them, in fact. Wilson's 14 points was a list of 14 things that Wilson would have liked to see after the conclusion of World War I. However, the only person who thought of most of these points were worthwhile was him. The fact that he would even propose this is seen as a great overextension of power, both internationally and domestically, and Wilson didn't have many people on his side. However, despite all this, one point was actually put into reality, and this was the dearest point to Wilson: the creation of an association of nations, which eventually became the League of Nations. After a long and grueling process on the part of Wilson, the League was eventually established in 1920. However, after all that hard work, he couldn't even get the United States to join the League. Congress voted against joining the League of Nations, and this action would uphold the values shared in Washington's farewell address, because the League of Nations was written to be an entangling alliance, which Washington warned of all those years ago. After the First World War and its ugly effects, the American people were determined to keep the United States isolated out of any foreign war. World War I was a grim reminder to the people of all nations of the horrors of war. Throughout the interwar period, which is the period between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second, many pushes were made towards neutrality internationally. One push to neutrality was the Kellogg-Briand Act, and no, this isn't a cereal, although that does sound kinda good right now. This was the pact between Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg and French Minister of Foreign Affairs Aristide Briand, and it had the objective to outlaw all wars within the world. It was signed in 1928 in Paris. However, its effectiveness was limited. If you tell someone not to do something, they may be inclined to do it. I know I am. Now, let's play a little game. See, right over there. That's Japan. Now let's see how much Japan cares about the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Oh wow, what a surprise. I guess they don't care at all. So, despite this pact being in place and being a member of the League of Nations, Japan would seize Manchuria because of its requirement for raw material to support its rapidly growing industry. The US, greatly appalled by this action from the Japanese government, would respond with the most effective way to restore the peace, the Stimson Doctrine. This doctrine stated that the United States would not recognize territory gained by aggression or territory gained by which violates international agreements. Now, let's play another game. Let's see how much Japan cares about this. Wow, what a surprise! The Japanese could care less if the US doesn't recognize their Manchurian holdings. Wow. So yeah, the Stimson Doctrine was a complete flop and was very ineffective against a militarist nation like the Japanese. This also shows how achieving worldwide peace is an extremely hard thing to pull off, and that the hopes of the US to achieve this feat internationally is just simply a fairy tale. In 1932, Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt would win against incumbent Republican Herbert Hoover. Roosevelt would follow Hoover's footsteps in restoring good relationships with Latin America through the Good Neighbor policy. Some actions Roosevelt would do to make the United States a good neighbor is by pulling out all U.S. troops in the Caribbean and by repealing the Platt Amendment, allowing Cuba to have independence from United States intervention. In the late 30s, the United States began to introduce the Neutrality Acts. These were 3 acts that were focused on keeping the United States neutral in conflicts. The first Neutrality Act would come in 1935 due to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. This banned the exportation of arms, ammo, or other implements of war. The second one soon followed in 1937 and was a response to the Spanish Civil War. This gave the president the authority to ban all belligerent ships from U.S. waters. However, FDR was by no means an isolationist, so this Neutrality Act allowed him to build relationships with other countries even if they were at war. Finally, there was the Third Neutrality Act in 1939 after the German invasion of Poland. This act lifted the embargo and put trade under cash and carry. However, American ships could not transport goods to nations at war or give them any loans. The purpose of the Neutrality Acts were to prevent the United States from getting involved in any conflicts by avoiding the very circumstances that pushed them into World War I. Although they did fluctuate on how interventionist the United States could have been from year to year, it was still quite consistent, all things considered. As we all know, World War II started when Germany invaded Poland and split it like a milkshake with the Soviet Union. This move made Britain and France ditch their policies of appeasement and actually, do something about the German threat. This is about the time the US passed the Third Neutrality Act of 1939, showing American hesitance to get involved due to the war's predecessor. That brings us to the election of 1940 between Wendell Willkie and the incumbent FDR going for a third term. Willkie would attempt to portray FDR as a threat to American neutrality in the war. However, Roosevelt snapped back and made a promise. In response to Willkie's convictions, FDR said to the public that their boys would never be sent into foreign wars, which helped push him to victory. However, the validity of this statement was soon to be tested. FDR began to support the Allies in their efforts against the Axis following his re-election. An example of this is the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which allowed the United States to support the Allies by exporting ammo, food, weapons, among other goodies while not violating its neutral position. The question of involvement in the war was a hot topic in 1941. Even passing the Lend-Lease Act to somewhat support the Allies caused a passionate debate between sides. The American public, although supporting the British efforts against Germany, still believed that the United States had to remain neutral. A minority, however, supported the war effort and believed the United States should be involved. As the year went on, the United States slowly inched itself towards war, helping the Allies out here and there along the way through the might of the American Navy. However, by the conclusion of that year, America became dead set on war. On December 8, 1941, the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor, and Congress would almost unanimously vote to declare war on the Japanese. The rest of the Axis declared war on America, and Congress gave them the same treatment. The Pearl Harbor attack would be the death of American isolationism, and the American people came together against the common foe, the Axis powers. The United States fought an impressive two-front war in the European and Pacific theaters and was a major contributor to the second victory for the Allied powers. Throughout the war, especially close to its conclusion, a variety of meetings took place between the Allies to determine what their vision of a post-war world would be. In August 1941, FDR met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to discuss the post-war Atlantic through the cleverly named Atlantic Charter. It called for national self-determination, more economic opportunities, free waters, and disarmament. In December of the same year, Churchill and Roosevelt announced the creation of the United Nations, more commonly known as the UN. This was an alliance between 26 nations, and this time around, FDR was actually able to get support for this organization by Congress, the American people, and most of the international community. Eventually, in 1945, a post-war United Nations was formed between 50 countries. The attitude towards the UN was different from the attitude towards the League of Nations due to one factor: timing. Wilson proposed the League of Nations at a time in American history where isolationism was favored. The American public felt as if they had wasted American lives in Europe, and were wary to even consider any foreign alliance which could entangle them into more hollow conflicts. Basically, Wilson was pretty ahead of his time. FDR, on the other hand, proposed it during a period of American national unity, in a time where isolationism was pretty much out the window because of Pearl Harbor and its involvement in World War II. Finally, we have the Yalta Conference in February 1945, which was pretty close to the end of the war and the defeat of Germany. It was between the US, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. It took place in Crimea as well. The three determined that Germany must surrender unconditionally and would divide into zones for each of them to occupy, like another birthday cake, maybe at a Sweet 16 this time. They would also, quote-unquote, agree to provide self-determination to the nations in Eastern Europe so that the people could decide what type of government they would like to have. However, Stalin didn't really know what Britain and the US meant by self-determination, so the USSR went around like a fairy godmother and made all these newly freed countries Soviet satellites. Well, here we are. Germany's gone, Japan got annihilated, and Italy chose the wrong side. With the conclusion of World War II in 1945, the United States was a brand new nation. Now under President Harry S. Truman, the United States would emerge as a world leader in the fight against their former ally, the Soviet Union. The Stalinization of Eastern Europe severely soured relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, and would embroider the two in a multi-decade conflict, the Cold War. The United States led the democratic and capitalist world against the Soviet Union through policies such as the Truman Doctrine, which provided $40 million to Turkey and Greece, two nations under the threat of conversion to communism. The logic Truman used in this doctrine was to increase the standard of living in these two countries, which would fend off the calls for communism. Noticing the success of this program, Secretary George C. Marshall proposed the Marshall Plan, creatively named, and it would provide over $15 billion in aid to recover Europe's economy. This move by Marshall was to ensure the remaining democratic nations in Europe didn't shift to communism by reinstating a strong economy throughout the continent. Both of these diplomatic moves by the United States helped to bolster its status as a leader against communism, developing its progress throughout the period of World War II. Before entering the war, the American public was very hesitant to get involved in anything foreign, and praised an ideology for isolationism. However, during the war and after, the ideas of FDR would push the United States onto the international stage to form modern American foreign policy. This demonstrates the significance of Pearl Harbor and involvement in World War II as the final threshold to full-blown American foreign involvement. FDR, who was still by no means an isolationist, pulled America out of its isolationism when he got the chance to do so with these circumstances. And after his death, Harry Truman would follow and lead America into the Cold War era. United States foreign involvement would drastically evolve during the time frame of 1898 to 1948. This was a time of transition for the United States from a nation committed to isolationism to a prominent world figure in the fight against communism. This shift to become this global leader became more and more inevitable as nations began to have more reliance on the United States, which was an all-time high by the conclusion of this period. The Spanish-American War was the introduction to interventionism to the United States. Yellow journalism and the sympathy for the Cuban people pushed and encouraged the American public to support this ideal, albeit briefly. This war gave the United States the chance to bolster its international presence by acquiring many of Spain's former colonies and lead to an age of heightened imperialism. However, through this time period, many were swift to reject the status of the United States as an interventionist power in the world. Some examples of this resistance include the Anti-Imperialist League against the annexation of the Philippines, the isolationist attitude of the American people in the interwar period, the passage of neutrality laws, among others. However, despite all these motives, factors such as Pearl Harbor, World War II, and the post-war plans created by FDR and other world leaders brought America, kicking and screaming, out of its isolationism and into its new place as an international figure. This modern version of American foreign policy is rooted in interventionism, with the United States intervening in conflicts worldwide. Examples of this are seen through the Korean War, Vietnam War, involvement in the Middle East, anti-terrorism, among a multitude of other conflicts. Another constant that was present throughout the majority of this period was imperialism. The definition of imperialism is when a nation expands its power through diplomacy or force. This is seen multiple times through developments such as the Roosevelt Quarterly, Wilson's relationship with Latin America, and American involvement in a variety of conflicts following this period. However, there have been many instances of the United States repealing these imperialist ideas, such as FDR's removal of the Platt Amendment and Wilson's denial of special American privileges at the Panama Canal. Even though it has been sowed out in some places, streaks with imperialist tendencies can be seen throughout the whole concept of interventionism itself. It is a technical example of a nation expanding its ideals in some way into another area. This isn't necessarily a negative thing, and the expansion of a nation's power to protect others from threats, such as the Truman Doctrine, are positive examples of this phenomenon. So, that's that. The period of 1898 to 1948 is a pretty weird area of American history, especially in foreign involvement, with constant shifts back and forth between interventionism and isolationism. Interventionism was a new ideal for America in 1898, and through its inevitable transition to a global leader, many people and events would encourage the U.S. to pull back the throttle, keep to itself as an isolationist. However, despite the horrors of World War I keeping America isolationist for a bit of time, World War II and Pearl Harbor gave America the confidence to accept its position as an international model. The transformed United States we observe in 1948 isn't too different from the US we already know and love today, with many of the same traits and policies consistently throughout the years. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a great day or night.